I call David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. That last speech was one of rhetoric but no substance, and it is typical from that member in his finance role. If the Labor Party had so many concerns about holes in this legislation, surely in the Select Committee they would have made those known and they would have sought to have them adjusted. They did not do so. They do not see any of the particular holes because it is all rhetoric that they are talking about. And when they talk about the main home test, that is the exemption that is in this bill for ordinary New Zealanders and will be in the Bright Line test as well, Bill. And we've got to look at it from a perspective of the ordinary New Zealand purchaser as well, and we do not want to put undue compliance on ordinary New Zealanders when they are purchasing properties. And the register notion that the previous speaker talked about is a very Soviet-era type of approach where everything and anything that anybody does has to go through government agencies before they can be approved. Mr Speaker, this bill is one which sets the information flows for government around those land transactions of the purchase of property, but also sets some rules around what some purchasers have to engage and deliver. And the first thing is that buyers and sellers will be required to provide ID numbers at the time the property is transferred. So this tax information will be provided to LINZ as part of the conveyancing process and then forwarded to the Inland Revenue. People that are tax residents in another jurisdiction will also be required to provide their foreign equivalent of an ID number. The second part of the bill requires offshore persons, as defined in the bill, to have a New Zealand bank account before obtaining an ID number. So that is the second requirement, and this ensures offshore persons are subjected to New Zealand's anti-money laundering rules, and that is an important part of the reasons behind this bill. Now, there are some clauses in the bill that were the subject of some submissions. We have 13 submissions, I think, that were received by the committee, and some of those represented around the offshore persons definition, the main home definition, and such like. This is tax legislation which cannot be overly prescriptive. It needs to give the ability for Inland Revenue to have some discretion in how it interprets some of that wording, and so they are new tests in some ways, but at the same time they are tests which enable the Inland Revenue to be able to apply the principles and policies that this bill seeks to achieve through their application of the meaning of those tests, rather than to be totally explicit in this legislation, which is something that tax legislation fails on many times because people just use those explicit definitions as a mechanism to get around it. So there is a little bit of broadness in the way it is structured around that terminology, but that is to provide the Inland Revenue with the ability to deliver the policy that this legislation seeks to achieve, which is that information around ID numbers and around those offshore persons, and at the same time not putting undue requirements on New Zealanders that are buying their main home that are exempt from those requirements. So this is a good bill and will be part of a suite of legislation that will deliver in this area. Thank you, Mr Speaker.